I'm Arthur, 38, and this all started back in college. A lifetime ago, it feels like. Let's set the scene. Early 2000s. Think dial-up modems, the rise of Google, and the lingering smell of burnt pizza in the dorm hallways. I wasn't exactly the life of the party. While everyone else was chugging cheap beer at frat parties, I was usually holed up in the computer lab, fueled by caffeine and the glow of a CRT monitor. Coding wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession, a way to build something from nothing, to bend the digital world to my will. I saw lines of code as a puzzle to be solved, a language to be mastered, a future to be built. I wasn't completely antisocial, mind you. I had a small circle of friends, other tech nerds who understood my fascination with algorithms and data structures. But dating? Forget about it. The thought of approaching a girl, let alone holding a conversation that didn't involve binary code, sent my palms sweating. I was comfortable in my world of logic and processors, and venturing outside of it felt intimidating. Then I met Eleanor. Sophomore year, Econ 101, a class I was failing miserably. Eleanor was the antithesis of everything I was: confident, articulate, and effortlessly brilliant. She always knew the answer. Her notes were meticulously organized, and she carried herself with an air of quiet grace that I found utterly captivating. I noticed her from day one, but the idea of actually speaking to her felt impossible. She was in a different league, a star student in a world I barely understood. One day, I was in the library, frantically trying to cram for a midterm. My notes were a chaotic mess, a jumbled collection of half-understood concepts and scribbled formulas. I was on the verge of a panic attack, convinced I was going to bomb the exam. That's when she appeared. "You're using the wrong syllabus," she said, her voice soft but firm. I looked up, blinking in surprise. Eleanor was standing beside my table, a stack of perfectly organized notes in her hand. Notes that were clearly superior to the garbage I was trying to decipher. "Here," she said, handing them to me. "These are mine, color-coded, updated, and actually helpful." I stared at the notes, then back at her, speechless. I don't know what to say. "Thank you." A small smile played on her lips. "You owe me coffee," and just like that, my life changed. We started studying together, and it quickly became about more than just economics. We talked for hours about our dreams, our fears, our ambitions. I learned that beneath her polished exterior, Eleanor was just as driven and passionate as I was. She had a vision for the future, a desire to make a difference in the world, and a fierce intelligence that both intimidated and inspired me. I fell for her hard. Meanwhile, there was Clarence, my best friend since high school. Where I was the awkward introvert, Clarence was the charismatic extrovert. He could charm the pants off anyone, negotiate his way out of any situation, and always knew how to make me laugh. We were opposites in almost every way, but we balanced each other out perfectly. He pushed me out of my comfort zone, encouraged me to take risks, and made sure I didn't spend my entire life staring at a computer screen. Together, we'd spent countless nights dreaming about starting our own business, about building something that would change the world. Looking back, those were simpler times, full of hope and naivete. Little did I know the storm that was brewing on the horizon. Fast forward a few years. Graduation, marriage, and the inevitable real-world grind. Eleanor and I tied the knot shortly after graduation. Clarence was my best man, delivering a speech that was equal parts hilarious and heartfelt. He knew me better than anyone, and he somehow managed to encapsulate our entire friendship in a 5-minute monologue that had everyone in tears. At that moment, standing there with Eleanor by my side and Clarence at my back, I genuinely felt like I had it all. Life after graduation wasn't exactly glamorous, though. The tech boom had fizzled, and the job market was tight. I ended up working long hours at a small, uninspiring software company, coding mundane applications and dreaming of something more. I poured every spare penny into savings, determined to one day break free and start my own venture. Clarence, ever the salesman, landed a lucrative job in medical device sales. He was good at it, naturally. He had the gift of gab, the innate ability to connect with people, and the drive to close a deal. But he wasn't passionate about it, not the way I was about coding or Eleanor was about, well, everything she did. We stayed in touch, meeting up on weekends to brainstorm business ideas. We threw around everything from a social media platform for pets way ahead of its time to a subscription box service for artisanal cheeses, thankfully. That one never got off the ground. Nothing seemed quite right, though. Nothing sparked the fire that we knew we needed to truly commit. After a couple of years of corporate drudgery, Clarence and I decided to take the plunge. We quit our jobs, pooled our meager savings, and started a small app development company. We called it Synergy Solutions. Cheesy, I know, but we were young and optimistic. Our idea was simple: to create user-friendly apps that streamlined everyday tasks. Ordering food, booking tickets, managing finances. We wanted to make life easier with just a few taps. It wasn't groundbreaking, but we believed we could do it better than anyone else. We started small, working out of Clarence's garage. Think cramped space, mismatched furniture, and the constant smell of motor oil. Clarence handled the business side, pitching our ideas to potential clients and hustling to secure deals. I focused on the coding, building the apps from the ground up. We didn't have much, but we had drive, determination, and a shared vision. And then there was Eleanor. She was my rock, my confidant, my biggest supporter. She believed in me even when I doubted myself. She'd stay up late with me, listening to me rant about bugs I couldn't fix, offering solutions I hadn't considered. She brought me coffee when I was pulling all-nighters, celebrated every small victory, and reminded me why we were doing this in the first place. One night, over a takeout pizza, she joked that she should quit her job and join us full-time. We laughed it off at the time, but the idea stuck with me. Eleanor was incredibly organized, detail-oriented, and great with numbers. She was exactly what we needed to keep the business running smoothly. About a year into the startup, Eleanor made the leap. She left her stable corporate job and officially became our operations manager. It was a huge risk, but it felt right. She was a natural at it, handling everything from scheduling and budgeting to client communication and marketing. Suddenly, things started to click. The three of us worked like a well-oiled machine. Clarence brought the charisma and the salesmanship. I brought the technical expertise, and Eleanor brought the organization and the strategic thinking. We weren't making much money, but we were building something we believed in. And for a while, that felt like enough. Our first big break came when one of our apps, a ticket purchasing platform called EventFlow, caught the attention of a small group of investors. They gave us enough funding to move out of Clarence's garage and into a tiny, cramped office space. It wasn't fancy, just a couple of desks crammed into a room with flickering fluorescent lights and peeling paint. But it felt like we'd made it. We were on our way. Eleanor threw herself into the job, managing operations with her usual efficiency and grace. Clarence and I focused on development, churning out new features and improvements to EventFlow. We spent countless late nights in the office, brainstorming, troubleshooting, and celebrating small wins. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we were on the verge of something big. Those were some of the best days of my life. I had a wife who believed in me, a best friend who shared my vision, and a company that was finally gaining traction. We weren't just co-workers, we were a family, a close-knit team working towards a common goal. Or so I thought. For a while, everything was good. Not perfect, mind you. Startups are never perfect. There were always challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But we were making steady progress. EventFlow was gaining popularity, attracting new users and generating revenue. We were expanding our team, hiring talented developers and marketing specialists. We were finally starting to see the fruits of our labor. We had a rhythm that worked. I'd spend my days immersed in code, building new features and squashing bugs. Clarence would be out schmoozing clients, securing new partnerships, and generally being the face of the company. Eleanor kept everything organized, managing budgets, coordinating schedules, and making sure we didn't run out of coffee. Our office was cramped, the AC barely functioned, and the furniture was cheap and uncomfortable. But there was an energy in the air, a palpable sense of excitement and possibility. We were building something special, something that could really take off. We were a team in every sense of the word. Then, things started to shift. At first, it was subtle. Little things that I didn't pay much attention to at the time. Eleanor and Clarence started texting each other more often, even outside of work hours. It didn't bother me at first. We were all working closely together, so it made sense that they would communicate frequently. But then the texts started getting more frequent, and they'd laugh about inside jokes I wasn't a part of. When I'd ask what was so funny, Eleanor would just wave it off with, "Oh, just something about the client meeting," and Clarence would nod along, his eyes gleaming with amusement. I didn't think much of it at the time. We were all under a lot of stress, working long hours, and dealing with the pressures of running a startup. It was natural that they would develop a closer bond, a shared sense of camaraderie. But then there were the late-night meetings. Eleanor started mentioning that she and Clarence needed to go over some projections after hours. At first, it was maybe once every couple of weeks, but then it became more frequent. I'd be at home, wrapping up my coding work, while Eleanor stayed at the office with Clarence, just trying to get ahead of the deadlines, she'd say. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? We were all busting our butts to make the startup succeed, and Clarence and Eleanor were two of the most important people in my life. I had no reason to doubt them. But then those late-night meetings turned into weekend work sessions. Eleanor would tell me they needed to hash out some details for the upcoming launch, and she'd spend hours at the office with Clarence. Sometimes she'd come home late, looking drained but oddly distant. When I'd ask how things went, she'd give vague answers. "Oh, it was fine. We're making progress." The thing is, I wasn't the kind of guy who second-guessed the people I trusted. I believed in loyalty, in giving the people close to me the benefit of the doubt. Questioning every move Eleanor or Clarence made just wasn't in my nature, but no matter how much I tried to ignore it, something just didn't sit right. It wasn't just the late nights and vague excuses. It was the way they both started acting around me. Eleanor and Clarence had always been friendly, but now it felt like they were almost too in sync. They'd finish each other's sentences, anticipate each other's needs, and share knowing glances that excluded me. Clarence, who'd always been my go-to guy for brainstorming or just unwinding after work, started pulling away. He'd cancel our usual hangouts with vague excuses like, "I've got too much on my plate," or "maybe next week, man." When we were in meetings together, he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly, barely engaging with the ideas we were throwing around. He seemed to avoid me as much as possible. Even when we did hang out, it wasn't the same. He'd zone out mid-conversation or give these half-hearted responses, like he wasn't really present. It was subtle at first, but over time it became glaringly obvious. The guy who used to be my biggest supporter now felt like a stranger, and I couldn't figure out why. One evening, I showed up at the office unexpectedly to drop off dinner. It was a Saturday, and Eleanor had told me they'd be working late to finalize some budgets. I figured I'd surprise them with takeout, since I hadn't seen much of Eleanor all week. When I got there, the office was quiet. Too quiet. I walked in, balancing the takeout bag, and called out, "Hey, guess what?" But there was no response. I figured they were in the conference room. It was their usual spot for these so-called work sessions. As I got closer, I heard voices. And then I heard laughter. It wasn't the kind of laughter you'd expect from a work discussion. It was softer, more intimate, personal. My chest tightened as I stood there, my hand hovering over the door. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that I'd walk in and find some harmless explanation. a perfectly reasonable excuse for the way they'd been acting. But I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open without knocking. And there they were. Eleanor was sitting close to Clarence, too close. Her hand was resting on his arm, like it belonged there, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The way she leaned towards him wasn't casual, it was deliberate, intimate, in a way that didn't belong in any work setting. At first, it didn't register. They'd worked together on plenty of projects before. Maybe this was just one of those moments. Maybe I was overthinking things. But then they saw me. The way they froze, their faces draining of color like kids caught red-handed, made my stomach drop. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. "What's going on?" Eleanor jumped up quickly, smoothing out her shirt, her eyes darting everywhere but at me. We weren't expecting you back so soon," she mumbled, glancing at Clarence like she needed a lifeline. "I thought you'd still be at the meeting," Clarence added, his voice way too casual. "I wrapped up early," I said, stepping further into the room and setting the takeout bag on the table. My hands felt shaky, but I tried to keep my movements steady. "Thought I'd bring you guys some good news." They just stared at me, their silence louder than anything they could have said. "What's going on?" I asked again, my tone firmer this time. Eleanor exchanged a quick glance with Clarence, and then she sighed, her shoulders slumping like she was carrying the weight of the world. "Look," she started, her voice soft but somehow sharp at the same time. "This isn't how we wanted you to find out." My heart sank. "Find out what?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. And that's when it all spilled out. They admitted they'd been seeing each other for months, sneaking around under the guise of work. It had started with late-night meetings and deepened over time. "According to Eleanor, it just happened," she said, her voice trembling but steady enough to be calculated. "We didn't plan for this." Clarence, always quick with the spin, jumped in. "It's complicated, man. We didn't want to hurt you. I just stood there, frozen." "Complicated?" That's what they were going with? Eleanor looked down, wringing her hands. "I'm not saying this to hurt you, but I've felt for a while now like we've been growing apart." She hesitated, her voice softening in a way that almost felt cruel. "You're always so focused on work, on the technical side of things. And with Clarence, it's just different. We connect in a way I don't feel with you anymore." My chest tightened, and for a second, I thought I might be sick. This wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about how she was framing it. Like our relationship was some sort of outdated project she'd lost interest in. Clarence nodded, chiming in like he was somehow part of this narrative. "We didn't mean for this to happen. It's just we've been spending so much time together, and it made us realize how much we have in common." Eleanor continued, her voice faltering but not stopping. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. It's not that I don't care about you, I do, but we've been drifting for a while now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't just admitting to the affair, they were justifying it, acting like their connection was some inevitable force of nature, while my relationship with Eleanor was nothing but an afterthought. I wanted to yell, to smack Clarence in the face, to call them out for what they'd done, but instead, I just stood there, numb. "Is that all?" I asked finally, my voice flat and cold. They exchanged another glance, like they weren't sure if they should say more. Finally, Eleanor whispered, "I'm sorry." Clarence nodded, though he didn't seem nearly as remorseful as he should have been. "Yeah, man. We didn't want it to come out like this." I stared at him, my eyes narrowing as the weight of his betrayal hit me all over again. This wasn't just anyone. This was the guy I trusted like a brother, the person who had been there through every high and low of my life. And now he was standing there, looking like he wanted to shrug it off and move on. I didn't respond. I just kept glaring at him, my silence heavy with all the things I could have said but didn't. Then I looked back at Eleanor, her head bowed, her hands fidgeting like she couldn't bear to meet my eyes. The two people I trusted most in the world. And this was how they'd repaid me. Without another word, I turned and walked out. That night, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore, surrounded by reminders of a life that now felt like a lie. Every object, every photograph, every scent was a painful reminder of what I had lost. The laughter, the shared dreams, the quiet moments of intimacy, all of it tainted by their betrayal. I checked into a cheap, anonymous hotel and tried to process what had just happened. I replayed the scene in my head over and over again, searching for answers, for explanations, for some way to make sense of it all. But there was no making sense of it. They had betrayed me, plain and simple. They had broken my trust, shattered my heart, and stolen my future. The next day, I filed for divorce. I didn't fight for anything. Not the apartment, not my share of the company, not even an explanation. I just wanted out. I wanted to sever all ties, to erase them from my life, to start over fresh. Let them have each other, I thought bitterly. Let them have the business we'd built together. I didn't care anymore, or at least, that's what I wanted them to think. I could see it in their eyes before I walked out of that room. They were bracing for a fight. They thought I'd yell, throw accusations, make some grand scene, maybe even try to burn everything down with them. But I didn't. My calmness seemed to throw them off, like they couldn't believe I'd just walk away. But what they didn't know was that I had a plan. I wasn't going to stoop to their level. No screaming, no dragging it out in public, no messy confrontation. I decided then and there that the best way to deal with this was to rebuild. Quietly, strategically, and ruthlessly. To let my actions speak louder than anything I could have said. Of course, walking away wasn't easy. It wasn't just losing Eleanor, it was losing Clarence too. The guy I thought would always have my back. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It felt like my entire world had been turned upside down. The foundation of my life had crumbled, leaving me adrift and alone. For weeks, I replayed every moment in my head, trying to figure out how I didn't see the signs. Every late-night meeting, every inside joke, every vague excuse, they all made sense now, in a way that made me sick. But no matter how much I overanalyzed, the result was the same. They'd made their choice, and now I had to make mine. I had to pick up the pieces of my shattered life and forge a new path. The divorce was finalized quickly. I packed up what little I had and moved to a different city. A city where no one knew my name, where I could disappear into the anonymity of the crowd. I didn't have a plan, just the faint hope that putting distance between myself and the mess might help me breathe again, might give me the space to heal, to rebuild, to become something new. I didn't know it then, but I was about to embark on a journey that would test my limits, push me to the brink, and ultimately transform me into someone I never thought I could be. Someone capable of building an empire and of serving revenge colder than ice. The first apartment I found was a tiny studio in a rundown part of town, the kind of place where you hear your neighbors arguing through the walls, the plumbing groans with every flush, and the hot water works sometimes. It was a far cry from the comfortable apartment I had shared with Eleanor, but it was all I could afford. My furniture consisted of a mattress on the floor, a folding table I used as a desk and dining table, and a single chair I'd grabbed off the curb. It wasn't much, but it did the job. It was a blank slate, a physical representation of the new life I was trying to build. I started working at a local coffee shop during the day to cover my bills. It wasn't glamorous work. I brewed endless pots of coffee, wiped down sticky tables, and dealt with demanding customers. But it paid just enough to keep the lights on and put food on the table. At night, I'd come back to my apartment, open my laptop, and lose myself in the only thing that made sense anymore: coding. You see, back when I was working with Clarence at the startup, I'd been quietly developing an idea on the side. It wasn't anything big at first, just a concept for a better way to integrate mobile payment systems with smaller businesses. A way to streamline transactions, reduce fees, and make it easier for local merchants to compete with the big chains. I'd even emailed it to Clarence, thinking it could be a great addition to what we were building with EventFlow. His response was dismissive. Too niche, he'd said. Too risky. Not worth the resources. That email stuck with me. Not just the words, but the way it felt like he didn't even consider it seriously. Like my ideas weren't worth his time. I let it go at the time, filed it away in the back of my mind. But I never stopped thinking about it. Now, with nothing to lose and no one to answer to, I started working on it in earnest. Every night, I'd sit at that folding table and dive into the code. The idea consumed me, fueled by equal parts desperation and the burning desire to prove that Clarence had been wrong. I envisioned a seamless payment platform tailored for small businesses. Easy to set up, affordable to use, and scalable to grow with their needs. I poured all my energy, my frustration, and my ambition into the project. I worked obsessively, driven by a relentless work ethic. I wasn't trying to get rich, but rather, I was trying to prove something to the world, more accurately to Eleanor and Clarence. They would come to regret their choices. I made a silent oath. The first year was brutal. I was living on instant noodles and whatever day-old pastries the baristas at the coffee shop gave me at the end of my shift. I barely slept, juggling my job during the day and the endless stream of coding, debugging, and late-night coffee runs during the night. Still, I kept going, fueled by a potent mix of desperation and defiance. Every line of code was an act of rebellion, a statement that I wouldn't be defeated, that I would rise from the ashes of my broken life and build something new. At first, I didn't tell anyone what I was working on. It felt safer that way, like it was mine and no one could take it from me. But as the app started to take shape, as the lines of code transformed into a functioning platform, I realized I couldn't do it alone. I needed help, I needed feedback, and I needed investors. So I started reaching out. Tentatively, nervously, I contacted a small group of people in the tech space. People I'd met at conferences, people I'd connected with online, people who I thought might be interested in my idea. I pitched my idea with as much passion and conviction as I could muster. I explained the problem I was trying to solve, the benefits of my solution, and the potential for growth. I laid out my vision for the future, a future where small businesses could thrive in the digital age. Slowly, things started to click. People were intrigued by my idea. They saw the potential, and some of them were willing to take a chance on me. I'll spare you the step-by-step details of how it all came together. The countless meetings, the nerve-wracking presentations, the endless negotiations. It wasn't a straight path. There were setbacks, moments where I thought it was all going to fall apart, and countless nights where I doubted myself. But I kept pushing. I learned from my mistakes, I adapted to the challenges, and I never gave up on my vision. I surrounded myself with talented and dedicated people who believed in what I was doing. And together, we built something amazing. Eventually, the app gained traction. First, with local businesses in my new city. They loved the simplicity of the platform, the low fees, and the personalized support. They started telling their friends, their colleagues, their customers, and the word started to spread. Then, larger businesses started to take notice. They were impressed by the app's ease of use, its scalability, and its innovative features. They saw the potential to streamline their payment processes, reduce their costs, and improve their customer experience. And before I knew it, my app was taking off. It was being featured in tech blogs, highlighted in industry publications, and praised by business leaders. It was becoming the go-to payment platform for small and medium-sized businesses across the country. Somewhere along the way, I stopped checking on Eleanor and Clarence. In the beginning, I'd look at their Instagram profiles late at night, hate scrolling through their curated lives. They were still running the startup, still attending fancy events, still smiling for the cameras, still putting on a show, making moves. One of Eleanor's captions said under a photo of them at some tech gala, "It stung to see them living the life I'd poured my soul into, the life I thought we were building together." But the busier I got with my own work, the less time I had to care. My own projects, my new team, a new vision kept me busy. The memories of what once was faded into the background as the future started taking center stage. I focused on my own work and my own team. By the time my app started making headlines, I wasn't thinking about them at all. I'd built a company and a product from the ground up. What started in a cramped studio apartment with a secondhand laptop had grown into something truly special. My team was small but passionate, and the platform was gaining recognition in the tech world. I started getting invitations to speak at conferences, to sit on panels about innovation and mobile payments. I was no longer working day and night in a small shop, barely able to make my rent. Now, me, the guy who once slept on a mattress on the floor, was suddenly being called a visionary in the industry. I could barely believe it. It was surreal. To go from rock bottom to the top of the world, all in a few short years. I felt like I was living in a dream, and I was determined to make the most of it. Of course, I knew Eleanor and Clarence must have heard about my success by then. The industry was small, and my name was becoming increasingly well-known. They weren't exactly doing great. Whispers had started reaching me through mutual acquaintances. Their product launches weren't meeting expectations. Investors were losing patience, and the startup was struggling to stay afloat. But I didn't gloat. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. I was content to let them watch from the sidelines as I built my empire, as I surpassed everything they thought I was capable of. Eventually, I stopped looking at their profiles altogether. It wasn't even a conscious decision. I was just too busy. The demands of running a growing company didn't leave much time for dwelling on the past. What they were doing or not doing didn't matter anymore. I was focused on the future, on building something bigger and better than anything I'd ever imagined. Then, one day, an email landed in my inbox from someone I hadn't thought about in years. Clarence. At first, I assumed it was spam, some sort of automated message or phishing attempt. But when I opened it, I quickly realized it was legitimate. The email was from Clarence's actual email address, the one I remembered from our college days. The tone was desperate, a far cry from the cocky, self-assured Clarence the first used to know. He was writing to me from a point of desperation, someone at their lowest. He went on about how things had been rough lately, how their startup was floundering, how investors had pulled out after a string of failed launches, how they were buried in debt. The tone was pathetic. Apparently, Clarence had been ousted by the board, forced out of the company he had co-founded, which was darkly poetic, considering how he and Eleanor once acted like they ran the world. Now, Clarence was cast out and alone. He rambled on, painting a bleak picture of his current situation. He was struggling to find work. His savings were dwindling, and he was facing the possibility of bankruptcy. Then, at the end of the email, he casually mentioned that he'd seen a job opening at a promising tech company in my city. Mine, obviously, though he had no clue I owned it. He wanted to throw his name in the ring. He listed his experience, highlighting his sales skills, his networking abilities, and his track record of success. He hinted at how his unique expertise could help the business grow. Clarence even used some of the company's own core values in the letter to make a connection. A separate email came a few hours later. This one was from Eleanor. Hers was dripping with regret, filled with vague nods to poor decisions and mistakes of the past. She talked about wanting a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life. She didn't directly ask for a job, but she suggested we meet for coffee to reconnect, as if years of silence and betrayal could be erased with a simple latte. Sitting there, staring at their emails, I couldn't decide whether to laugh or be annoyed. After years of silence, after everything they'd done, they were asking me for a lifeline. The audacity was breathtaking. The arrogance was staggering. They had hurt me, betrayed me, and left me for dead. And now, when they were down on their luck, they expected me to just open my arms and welcome them back into my life? It was almost comical. For a moment, I considered deleting the emails and moving on, pretending I never saw them, letting them wallow in their misery. They deserved, after all. But then a different thought occurred to me. A more interesting thought. What if I didn't just ignore them? What if I used this opportunity to even the score? The idea was deliciously tempting. I could bring them into my company, put them in their place, and watch them squirm. I could make them work for me, under my command, knowing that I held their futures in my hands. It would be the ultimate revenge. So I decided to play along. I crafted a carefully worded response to each of them, expressing my surprise at hearing from them and my willingness to explore potential opportunities. I forwarded their emails to HR, along with a request to schedule an interview for an entry-level position. The most basic job I could find, something beneath their skill set, something that would force them to swallow their pride. I didn't tell them what I was planning. I wanted them to come in with high hopes, with expectations of a grand reunion and a lucrative job offer. I wanted to watch their faces when they realized the truth. I made sure the interviews were scheduled back to back so I could maximize the discomfort, and I made sure to clear my schedule for the day. I wouldn't miss this for anything. The anticipation was building. I could barely sleep the night before. I was like a kid on Christmas Eve, except instead of waiting for presents, I was waiting for the chance to unleash my carefully crafted revenge. The day of the interview arrived, and I won't lie, I was practically buzzing with nervous energy. It felt like all the years of hurt, anger, and resentment were finally coming to a head. I spent the morning reviewing their resumes, mentally rehearsing the questions I was going to ask, and imagining their reactions. I wanted to make sure everything was perfect. I wanted to savor every moment of their humiliation. I didn't give them any advanced warning that I'd be there. I wanted to surprise them, to catch them off guard. I knew they were expecting to meet with some faceless HR representative, not with the guy whose life they had destroyed. The position they were interviewing for was a junior support specialist. A basic job, mostly involving answering customer queries and troubleshooting technical issues. The starting salary wasn't anything to write home about, but it was a job. And right now, they needed a job. I sat in the interview room, waiting, keeping an eye on the clock. The tension was almost unbearable. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms sweating, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Finally, the door opened, and there they were. Clarence and Eleanor walked in together, side by side, just like old times. They looked different, older, more worn, less polished. The confidence they used to exude had been replaced with a nervous apprehension. The sparkle in their eyes had faded, leaving behind a dull, lackluster glaze. The moment they saw me sitting at the head of the table, their faces froze. The color drained from their cheeks, their mouths dropped open, and their eyes widened in disbelief. Clarence's usual confident demeanor faltered. He stammered, stumbled over his words, and looked like he wanted to bolt out of the room. Eleanor looked like she wanted to disappear, to be swallowed up by the floorboards. They were clearly not expecting this. "Luke, Eleanor," I said evenly, gesturing to the chairs across from me. "Thanks for coming in." They hesitated, exchanging a quick glance before reluctantly sitting down. The silence in the room was thick and heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. I leaned back slightly, adopting a professional tone. "So," I began, "let's talk about the position." Clarence tried to recover first, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Yeah, sure," he said, his voice strained and unnatural. I wasn't expecting you to be here." "Well," I said simply, "it's my company. I like to stay involved." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting them sink in. Eleanor fidgeted with the edge of her portfolio, avoiding eye contact. She looked uncomfortable, ashamed, and utterly defeated. I kept the tone professional, walking them through the job description, the responsibilities, and the salary. I made sure to emphasize the entry-level nature of the position, the long hours, and the limited opportunities for advancement. They were both too stunned to say much, which gave me all the confirmation I needed that they hadn't expected this, that their fantasies of a triumphant return had been shattered. Clarence cleared his throat, trying to regain some composure. "This position seems a bit lower level than I thought," he said carefully, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. "Oh?" I replied, feigning surprise. "Well, based on your experience and the recent history of your company, this seemed like the right fit. Unless, of course, you think it's not a good match?" I knew I was twisting the knife, but I couldn't resist. I wanted to see how far they would go, how much they were willing to swallow their pride to get back on their feet. Eleanor finally spoke up, her voice quieter than I remembered. "We were hoping for something a little more aligned with our previous roles," she said, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Ah, I see." I nodded slowly, pretending to consider her words. "Unfortunately, we don't have anything higher level available at the moment. But this position could be a great opportunity to, rebuild." The words weren't accidental. I wanted them to know that I knew, that I was fully aware of their situation, and that I was deliberately rubbing it in their faces. Clarence's face turned red, and he opened his mouth to respond, but then he closed it again. He knew that anything he said would only make things worse. For a guy who always had something to say, the silence was telling. The rest of the interview went about as well as you'd expect. They stumbled through their answers to basic questions, clearly unprepared for what they were walking into. They struggled to articulate their skills and experience, their confidence completely shattered. I could see the frustration bubbling beneath Clarence's surface as he realized this wasn't going to end the way he'd imagined. He started to get defensive, argumentative, and even a little bit rude. Eleanor, on the other hand, remained quiet and subdued, her eyes fixed on the floor. She seemed to have accepted her fate, resigned to the fact that she had made a terrible mistake. When the interview was over, I stood up and extended a hand. "Thanks for coming in," I said, my voice polite but cold. "We'll let you know." They left without another word. The tension in the room dissipated as the door closed behind them, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. It felt good. Really good. Years of resentment and anger had finally been released. I had gotten my revenge, but something was still missing. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. The victory felt hollow. Later that evening, I got an email from Clarence. It wasn't a thank you note or a follow-up about the interview. It was a rant. He accused me of humiliating him, of using the interview to settle old scores, of being petty and vindictive. He claimed that I owed him for the opportunities he'd given me when we were starting out, for the sacrifices he'd made for the company, for the risks he'd taken on my behalf. He conveniently omitted the fact that he had slept with my wife, betrayed my trust, and left me with nothing. And then he made his boldest claim yet. He claimed that he had contributed to the core idea behind my app and deserved compensation. That without his vision and business acumen, my app would never have succeeded. I sat there staring at the screen, not sure whether to laugh or be angry. The audacity of this man was truly astounding. He had dismissed my original idea as too niche and too risky. He had laughed at me, belittled me, and told me I was wasting my time. And now, he was trying to claim credit for my success? It was beyond ridiculous. Luke's email was a mess of entitlement and desperation, but it was that last part that stood out. He was trying to stake a claim on something I'd built from scratch, an idea he dismissed as too risky when I first pitched it to him years ago. The sheer gall of it took my breath away. He really thought he could just waltz back into my life and demand a piece of my success after everything he'd done? I didn't respond right away. I needed to calm down, to collect my thoughts, and to figure out the best way to respond. I went for a walk, trying to clear my head. I replayed our past interactions in my mind, searching for any shred of evidence that might support his claim. But there was nothing. He had never contributed anything to my app. He had only ever dismissed it, discouraged me, and tried to steer me in a different direction. Then an idea struck me. A way to expose his lies, to shut him down once and for all. I went back to my apartment, sat down at my computer, and started digging through my old email archives. It took a while, but eventually I found exactly what I was looking for. The original email I'd sent him back at the startup, outlining the concept for my app, and his response. Too niche, too risky, not worth the resources. The receipts were clear. I saved the emails as PDFs, printed them out, and put them in a folder. Then I drafted a short, professional response to Luke. I received your email, I wrote. I suggest you consult with an attorney before making any further claims. Then I hit send. I knew this wasn't the end of it. Clarence wasn't going to give up that easily, but I was ready for him. I had the evidence, the resources, and the will to fight him every step of the way. He had made a mistake. He had underestimated me. And now, he was going to pay the price. As anticipated, Clarence's next move was as predictable as it was pathetic. He actually tried to sue me. Yes, you read that right. The guy who dismissed my original idea as too niche and not worth the resources had the unmitigated gall to claim that my entire company was built on his idea. The same idea he laughed off years ago. The irony could choke a donkey. Honestly, a part of me was almost impressed. The sheer audacity required to pull something like that off was, well, it was almost admirable in a twisted sort of way. Almost. Of course, I knew he didn't have a leg to stand on. His claim was based on nothing but wishful thinking, and a desperate attempt to salvage his ruined reputation. But that didn't mean I could just ignore it. I had a company to protect, a reputation to uphold, and a team of employees who depended on me. So I lawyered up. I hired the best legal team I could find and prepared to fight back. I wasn't going to let Clarence get away with this. I won't bore you with all the details of the legal process. It was tedious, time-consuming, and incredibly stressful. There were depositions, interrogations, and mountains of paperwork. My lawyers poured through every line of code, every email exchange, every business document, searching for any evidence that might support my case. But I will say that sitting across from Clarence in a courtroom was surreal. To see him reduced to a desperate, pathetic figure, clinging to a false narrative in a last-ditch effort to save himself, was almost sad. Almost. I still haven't forgotten what he has done. He tried to portray himself as the visionary genius behind my app, claiming that he had provided the initial spark of inspiration and guided me every step of the way. He even brought in Eleanor to testify on his behalf, hoping she would corroborate his story. But Eleanor's testimony backfired spectacularly. She looked uncomfortable and evasive on the stand, struggling to maintain eye contact with me. She admitted that Clarence had initially dismissed my idea, but then claimed that he had come around later and offered valuable feedback. But under cross-examination, her story fell apart. She couldn't provide any specific examples of his feedback, and her answers became increasingly vague and contradictory. It was clear she was lying, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. She could not defend a story that had no legs to stand on. Fast forward to the day of the verdict, and let me just say, it wasn't even close. I walked into court armed to the teeth with irrefutable evidence. You remember those emails? The ones where Clarence dismissed my idea as too niche? Yeah, those came in handy. I came in armed with receipts. The email where I pitched the concept to him, his dismissive response, timestamps showing when I started working on the code, and everything else I needed to shut this nonsense down. My legal team presented a rock-solid case, meticulously dismantling Clarence's flimsy claims one by one. They showed that I had conceived the original idea, developed the app entirely on my own, and built the company from the ground up without any significant input from Clarence. They presented those original emails, showing that Clarence had not only failed to support my idea, but had actively discouraged me from pursuing it. They presented financial records, showing that I had funded the development of the app with my own savings, not with any contributions from Clarence. They even presented expert testimony from other developers, who testified that my code was original and innovative, and that it showed no evidence of any influence from Clarence. Clarence's case was as weak as his excuses during that awkward job interview, and it crumbled under the weight of the evidence. It became clear that he had no legitimate claim, and that he was simply trying to extort me for money. The judge ruled in my favor so quickly it felt like they were doing me a solid just to save everyone's time. The gavel slammed down with the force of a thunderclap, declaring that Clarence's claims were baseless and without merit. The judge was brutal. He lambasted Clarence for his frivolous lawsuit, accusing him of wasting the court's time and attempting to profit from my hard work and ingenuity. He ordered Clarence to pay my legal fees and issued a stern warning against any future attempts to harass or defame me. In that moment, I felt a surge of relief, vindication, and, well, maybe just a tiny bit of satisfaction. It was over. I had won, and Clarence had lost. Big time! Now, not only is he jobless, but he's also drowning in legal fees. I guess karma works overtime sometimes. And Eleanor? She faded into the background, a silent witness to Clarence's downfall. I haven't heard from her since, and frankly, I don't care to. I was still not able to enjoy the triumph completely. There was too much animosity and history associated with what I had done. I've had some time to reflect on all that has happened to me. I started this journey feeling betrayed, angry, and lost. I channeled those emotions into building a business empire, fueled by a desire for revenge. I got my revenge. I saw my enemies brought low. I watched their dreams crumble before their eyes. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The satisfaction was fleeting, the victory hollow. The emptiness I felt after Clarence slunk out of that courtroom has lingered with me since. It may always linger with me. I realized that revenge, while momentarily gratifying, is ultimately a destructive force. It consumes you, blinds you, and prevents you from moving on. It's like trying to quench a fire with gasoline. It might give you a temporary rush, but it will ultimately burn you in the end. I had spent so long focusing on my enemies that I had forgotten about myself. I had neglected my own well-being, sacrificed my own happiness, and allowed my life to be defined by the actions of others. And for what? A fleeting moment of triumph that left me feeling empty and unfulfilled. I've learned that true success isn't about tearing others down. It's about building yourself up. It's about focusing on your own goals, pursuing your own passions, and creating a life that is meaningful and fulfilling. It's about forgiveness, not for them, but for myself, for letting their actions define me for so long, for allowing their betrayal to consume me, for wasting so much time and energy on seeking revenge. I don't know what the future holds. I may never fully heal from the wounds of the past. I may always carry a scar from the betrayal. But I do know that I'm ready to move on, to focus on building a life that is not defined by revenge, but by purpose, passion, and a genuine desire to make a positive impact on the world. Now, I am taking the time to enjoy the fruits of my labors. I sold my company for a king's ransom and have decided to dedicate myself to philanthropic endeavors. I will use my talents and resources to help make the world a better place, and maybe finally be able to put the demons of my past to rest. I am Arthur, and the story is now over. I hope someone can learn from my experience. I truly do.